everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion this afternoon. Today we're going to be talking about stronger identity verification, in particular, new criteria for document authentication. On our panel today, don't know when people are watching this, so on our panel today, we have Ray Rivera beside me, who's the Director of Certification for the FIDO Alliance. Next to her is Stephanie Schuckers, who's the Director at the Center for Identification Technology Research at Clarkson University. And then on the far end, we have Jeremy Grant, who's Managing Director of Technology and Business Strategy at Venable. I'm going to have Jeremy begin. Each of our members, or each of the panelists, will give a brief overview of different aspects of this, but I'm going to ask Jeremy to introduce the topic so we have a reference point.
Sure. Well, hey everybody, great to see you, both in person and those who are watching virtually. So what I wanted to do, just at the start of this, was to set the stage a little bit for why FIDO is now working on a new certification program around document authentication and remote identity proofing. FIDO's roots, as you all know, is in authentication, where we've essentially set the standards that are now being pointed to across the world and being used in many places to move from knowledge-based authentication, things like passwords or other shared secrets, to possession-based authentication, which is a lot more secure. And over the last few years, when I've been asked, what in the broader identity space, how would you characterize the progress we're making in terms of making things more secure? I've always said, well, authentication's getting easier, in part because of things like FIDO, but the identity proofing side's getting a lot harder. In that, across the globe, a lot of the tools that we have used for remote identity proofing have been coming under increased attack from different adversaries. And things haven't been getting better there. In fact, they've been getting worse. And so we started to see an evolution a few years ago where people were moving away from knowledge-based identity verification, things like quizzes from credit bureau scores, to some newer tools that seem really promising. How can you use, say, your smartphone to take a picture of your driver's license, figure out whether it's real or not, take a selfie, and see if you can match a one-to-one match against the picture that's on that ID card. And it was, again, an interesting trend. Much as FIDO authentication was moving from knowledge-based authentication to possession-based authentication, we started to do this in the identity verification side as well. But it created a real problem in that there is now a flood of companies coming into the market who all say they do this the best. They obviously can't all be right. And within FIDO, if you look at the FIDO board, it's a mix of companies who are both making security solutions and those who are customers of it. And a lot of those companies, particularly in financial services, said, we're really interested in this stuff, but man, we don't want to, every time we're looking at this, we have to run our own bake-off among 20 different companies, which then shifted to the question of how could FIDO help? And FIDO had not gotten into identity verification in the past. We've been narrowly focused on just the authentication side, but it was always sort of looming out there as something that FIDO Alliance, when you look at its 300 plus members and everybody who it's gathered together, would be in a really good position to take on other things that were adjacent in identity. And this is really where the focus on certification came in. So, some of you have gotten to know Ray, if not you should, and Stephanie, who have worked together along with a lot of others in FIDO on different aspects of certification programs, starting with the functional certification program, where there's more than 850 certified authenticator products, a security certification program, where we start to set criteria where independent labs come in and test, a biometrics component certification program, I think the first of its kind commercially across the globe, looking at commercial biometric sensors. Could we, for identity verification, come up with a way to basically set performance standards for these, I'll call them DocAuth and Selfie Match tools, and then have a way that independent labs could partner with the Alliance to test and certify those? So that's sort of setting the stage for where we're at today. And now we're thinking to talk a little bit more about what should be coming soon and the progress we've been making.
Thanks, Jeremy. So Ray, could you give us, fill us in a little more on the whole certification approach that we're taking here?
Yeah, so there's, as Jeremy said, that there really isn't a program or certification or literally requirements in this industry to set those standards. And so FIDO Alliance is making that happen, so to speak. And what we were seeing when we started to develop this program is, and trying to identify the requirements of what this would look like, there really isn't a reference point to begin. And we started talking to other labs, trying to, discussing with our members who joined, to develop this certification program, to find those requirements, that everything was kind of all over the board. and there wasn't really any set specific criteria, so their testing could happen and they could say that they meet certain requirements, but what are those requirements and how do you prove that those requirements have been met? So it seemed like it was just, wild territory out there, and what FIDO Alliance decided was, hey, we should probably set some requirements and we should probably set some testing thresholds in order to prove that these companies that develop these products, the vendors actually issuing out these products, meet that criteria and it meets these requirements, and and then develop the certification program around those requirements. So currently the requirements are under development for the document authenticity. We do have work being done on our selfie match portion, so that's soon to come out as well. And then binding is a little bit behind the game as far as what that's going to look like, but it's definitely an interest, and it's kind of the whole, the package is a whole package. There will be independent certifications, but it's a whole package that an organization could technically come in and certify a package deal that is from document authenticity to the binding aspect. So that's kind of where we're looking at right now. We have a couple labs, about 3 labs that we've engaged with. We've kind of looked at them to kind of, hey, here, review this and see if this makes sense. Is this something that you could test against? Is it viable? And does it make sense? And so what we've found is that there are labs out there that do this. There are labs out there capable of doing this type of testing. So we're working on accrediting them and bringing them on board to do the certifications for this. And the whole goal, actually, for not only just writing the requirements, but also the certification that goes along with those requirements to validate the products in the marketplace is, if you were on my talk, for the value of certification, from a standards perspective, if you write a standard and you want to make sure that it has validity in the marketplace, then the certification components need to exist in order to show that that standard is a viable standard and meets that criteria. The other thing is, as Jeremy mentioned, regulatory aspects. So it's really big for this program from a regulatory perspective. It's very, there's, identity proofing. When you look at the financial industry, healthcare industry, and all the risks involved in all the fraud that takes place. And then you get into your government securities and things like that. So it's really important that not only do we write these requirements, but we also have a way for vendors to show that they meet those requirements and work towards more security and privacy for this whole program and what it represents.
Great. Thank you, Ray.
Yeah.
Stephanie, could you fill us in on, more in-depth on the requirements and actual testing aspects of all this?
Yeah, sure. So the way we approached this problem was really broken it into 2 parts. There's the document authentication piece of it, or the document verification piece of it, and then there's the face verification piece of it. And I think we've left it so that those 2 would be 2 separate programs. If somebody wanted to, right now, no final decisions are made, but we are finding that in the marketplace, some vendors have one solution or have the other solution, and then other vendors may put them together and package them in one piece. So it seemed to make a lot of sense to keep those 2 separate, but then, of course, allow people to come who have both into certification. So that's where we're at right now, and we're writing those requirements separately. So I'm going to cover each one in terms of the requirements. For the document verification piece, essentially what the goal is when you take a photograph of a document, you're trying to determine, is this a legitimate document? So you're trying to gather off the information from the document, and then you're also trying to get the picture of the individual. And that's to be used later for the selfie match, but we'll come back to that. So back to the document. So the way the test is broken up is in 2 parts. Basically, one part's like an algorithm test. What we're testing is how good, when you put in an image of a real document, is the algorithm able to determine it's a real document, and then of course reject any frauds. And how they reject frauds, is the secret sauce that those companies have, which relate to things like looking for the format that you would expect to find in the ID, what type of security features that you could possibly measure from the context of a photograph, and checking the barcode to ensure that the barcode's consistent with the data that's you read from the optical character recognition, things like that. But again, we don't prescribe what the vendors would do in terms of the determination of the fraud. We just say it's sort of, to tell us, fraud, not fraud. So that's the kind of algorithm test. I'm an engineer, so I think of it that way, but basically it's kind of like the back-end engine test, right? And what the lab will do, this independent lab, will have this set of images of legitimate documents and a set of images of fraud, and use that. And what we're asking the vendor to do would be to provide their solution kind of out of band, so that the lab has complete control over that solution, such that they can ensure that there's no human reader in the loop. And I understand some have human readers, but what we're focusing is on the algorithm portion of it. And then there's a second part of the test, which relates to the kind of the user experience, the capture, because as we know, right, a good experience, or a good algorithm needs to have a good image as its input in order to make those decisions. So those tests are focused primarily on the legitimate user with the legitimate document. And so there will be real people coming in and presenting their legitimate document, and then that would go up and a decision would be made. So the frauds are only on the image side right now as part of the test. And part of the reasons are related to the logistics of obtaining fraud and being able to use that fraud for testing from the laboratory side. So that's, how am I doing? So that's,
Great.
I'm I'm halfway done. Whew.
You're fine.
Okay, all right. Good. And I'm happy to answer questions if you want to hear details. He's going to keep me on time here.
You're good.
So all right, the second half has to do with the face matching. So we have a program for biometric component certification, that Jeremy alluded to, for FIDO authenticators. Well, this is a different beast, but similar in a lot of ways, right? You are basically evaluating, two pieces. How well does the face match, the face gathered from the document, as well as is there a real user there, the liveness piece. And so in that test, but there's one major fundamental difference, between our biometric component certification and what we want to do with the selfie match testing, which is that the image that you're comparing against is from the document. In a FIDO authenticator, if it's face, you're enrolling with the selfie and then you're matching with the selfie. In this case, you're enrolling with the enrollment image is coming off the document, and then you're matching with the selfie against it. And so from a testing perspective, we're still working out the requirements, but the idea is, again, a person would come to the lab with their legitimate document, and then there would be an enrollment phase where they take a photo of their document, then that image would be extracted, and then take a selfie and match against that image. And after that, the way the metrics work for biometrics are very similar to the component. So we imagine that a lot of the things in our biometric component certification can be reused. For those, of course, there's the probability that the real person's rejected when they shouldn't be. And then there's the kind of security risk, right? The probability that someone has your document, and then they match accidentally. We call that a brute force attack, right? They and that's usually some very, very low number, which we can measure using comparisons of many individuals. What about liveness? So part of that piece, and one of the attack vectors, of course, would be, particularly for face, your face is not a secret, is the fact that individuals may be able to do a targeted attack and create, a fake document for you as well as your face, right? Using, the simplest thing might be to print out your face image onto a piece of paper, or display it on a display. And so the way we protect from that, and way solutions are protecting from that is through liveness detection or through the ISO standard called presentation attack detection. So part of the biometric testing, and this will be similar to what we do with Component, will be to actually make fakes and demonstrate that the solution is able to reject those fakes. And so that's kind of the big picture, even though it took me a while to say it all, of what it's looking like right now. We have a team of people working on it, and the leaders are doing a great job of leading the group towards getting requirements out there.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. So, Jeremy, I'm just going to toss you, lob this big softball over to you. Regulators, policymakers, do they care?
Yes. I think what's interesting about the emergence of this program is it's coming at a really interesting time. We've been dealing with this problem of remote identity verification for years. Remember I said before, authentication is getting easier and identity proofing is getting harder because the attackers caught up with knowledge-based verification, and then there's this new stuff and nobody's quite sure what to do with it. And because the identity proofing side's been getting so much harder, we're seeing more and more attackers look to exploit some really easy to exploit weaknesses. And that just, went on hyperdrive during the pandemic because we suddenly found ourselves for a good 18 months in an environment where we couldn't do in-person transactions anymore, including in-person identity proofing. If you wanted to get something done online, they had to try to figure out who you were. And not surprisingly, we've seen identity fraud skyrocket over the last 18 months. I mean, just in the government benefit side alone here in the US, a conservative estimate is more than $100 billion was stolen, which is like nearly twice the budget that we spend on the entire Department of Homeland Security. So there's some people who are pretty pissed off right now and a little concerned about what we do to address it. And I think what's interesting about the way FIDO's approaching it, so we're seeing some requirements certainly in the US right now that in government benefit systems, if somebody's applying with remote identity proofing, it's got to be a solution that's been certified against NIST IAL2, Identity Assurance Level 2, which is good, but how have we certified these solutions for years? Well, it's been through efforts like, trust frameworks like Kantara or Safe Biopharma that essentially, put out a stack of materials that says, well, we'll have an auditor go through the way you assess identity and then see if you, comply with everything, which has been okay, but it hasn't exactly set the world on fire in terms of people saying, well, we want to use these solutions. And I think there's been a bigger challenge with it, which is even though you might be able to pass, through this checklist going through the audit process to show that you're taking the right steps, it doesn't answer a deeper question, which is how well does this stuff work? And what differentiates vendors from one another? And so as we start to get to, I think we might, 6 months from now, because of this IL2 requirement, have, 10, 12 vendors that are out there that have this. This new FIDO identity verification certification program will actually start to answer the question of, okay, great, you can pass the process audit, but now let's put you in the lab and actually see how you deal with different kinds of fakes and different kinds of attacks. And let's start to separate those products that actually can handle this versus those who can't. And so I think that's going to be pretty significant. There's been a lot of interest in this from governments across the globe, and that I think it's the first time anybody's tried to come up with a certification program for these products. And between governments that are actively participating or querying us every few months to ask us, when do we get to look at this and see if we can use this for our own purposes, I think this is going to be a program that's going to be of great interest to both industry and government globally.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. So we actually have some good time left, and I can certainly bring some questions to the audience, or to the panels myself, but see who's got questions from the audience. And yes, if you could please use the mic, that'd be great.
Hi, Bruce Giovanni. Is it on? Bruce Giovanni, Easy Dynamics. Are you?
They're fixing it, I think.
I actually have two questions. How are you taking into account the conformance criteria NIST published in June of 2020? And how is equitable access, or are you covering a broad range of demographics in your tests?
So the first question was, how are we, sorry.
So NIST in 2020 published
Conformance criteria
Thank you. Yes.
for IAL2. How is that being factored into your requirements development? And the second question was equitable access, a hot topic today.
I don't,
Yeah.
I think
So-
yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. you want to.
Hot
We're
potato.
not.
So definitely.
I can jump in on the latter, which is
Right.
I think on the equitable access front, it's been a big question that's come up of, look, you don't just want to line up 400 white men and test them and then proclaim that a product works really well. I mean, it might for them.
Right.
And so, as you know, one of the things we've been talking about is as we're coming up with criteria with the labs, how do we actually ensure that they're bringing in a diverse array of different types of subjects so that we can actually say this works not just for one group, but for everybody.
And we do have requirements around that. Just the first part of the question,
Yeah.
We don't.
Population.
Right, yeah. So we have requirements around gender, we have requirements around age, and, I think race and ethnicity is a little bit trickier, in terms of how we handle. We have some wording around essentially the subject population should be reflective of your target population for where you're selling the product. And the reason why we do that is because we're a global organization, but the product may be local, right? That's being certified, So the vendor, when they come in, needs to explain, this is targeted toward, Colorado driver's license, and so that's, who, what our population should look like, and that's how we're handling race and ethnicity.
So as far as the other.
Go ahead.
No, is that in reference to the 863?
Yeah, the 863 conformance criteria. So to be clear, I don't think these solutions are by themselves going to meet IAL2.
Right.
It is going to be a component that can feed into it. So we've looked at, the conformance criteria that they put out, but I think we're trying to just first figure out from a performance testing perspective, again, there's, what NIST put out, I think, feeds much more into like if I'm doing a Kantara assessment and I'm not necessarily sure all the requirements go into the way that we're looking at it. So we've looked at them, but it's not driving the activity.
Yeah. Our other areas have, however, in the Authenticator certification, we've done a complete mapping.
I've got a question that came online, and it relates back to NIST 863. It says it defines identity proofing phases as resolution, validation, verification. Third-party vendors are hampered with verification because issuing authorities don't allow access to their data, e.g. DMV. What solution do you see to that problem? You want to take it, Stephanie, or?
I mean,
We want it.
this gets into a much bigger. So I'm wearing my Better Identity Coalition socks, which is another hat I wear with another organization that a lot of you all are members of and participate in, which is looking to get to that question, which is how do you actually get attribute validation from the authoritative source? And it's something that's going to require definitive government action, and that government's the only nationally recognized authoritative issuer of identity, but all their stuff stuck in the paper and plastic world. We've made progress, at least in the U.S. The Social Security Administration for new financial services, new credit transactions now does attribute validation, but there's a ton of stuff that still needs to happen. That's, FIDO's not tackling directly, but there are efforts, I would say, globally to try to, bring those data sources in as well. Although it raises a ton of issues around program design and how do you get consent and ensure a high bar for security and privacy and whatnot. We've only got 2 minutes left, so I can't solve all of those problems in that time.
Thank you. Another question here.
Yes, Daryl Goyce. So one of the big challenges is the most expensive portion of this will be collecting the PII for testing, right? And what happens with a lot of these programs is that the data gets very stale. And so the product companies just tune their algorithms to your data set. And that's what happened with NIST, with the facial and fingerprint technology, right? So what is your goal to keep revenue coming in a sense, budget being allocated to keep those galleries fresh? In addition, many of these states have 200 different template types for an ID, like the state of California. How are you going to make sure that it's representative?
Yes, we've wrestled a lot with that. That's a very challenging problem. At first we were discussing that the vendor would claim, the types of documents that they support with their solution, and then we would cover some percentage of them. We recently kind of swung all the way to, I'd say, the most restrictive stance, which is if you claim to support it, the lab needs to test it. And so may not need to test, a huge number of them, but they need to at least test some of them. We'll probably I'm guessing, because just like the problem you said, we'll probably have to let off a little bit on that, and particularly as it relates to multiple versions, from the same state, because it gets really complicated really fast from a laboratory point of view. But on the flip side, that does help with your question, right? You'll always have to be refreshing from a laboratory point of view because these IDs get refreshed, right? So the data set can't get stale. Plus the certification, it's not an inexpensive process, right? So unlike NIST testing where it's basically free, right, to submit your algorithm, this is going to cost because it involves real human subjects coming, working with your products. So in that sense, you can't really tune to the data set because you would have to pay every single time you wanted to go back for certification. So I think that'll help a little bit with that. It's imperfect, the solution that we're talking about, but I think from the point of view of separating the wheat from the chaff, it's a good first step, right? I think that's our thinking, so we'd rather get something out imperfect, and help the marketplace differentiate, and really help the vendors differentiate themselves as well as the people who are buying the stuff, right? Make decisions about what vendor they're going to choose. And hopefully it'll be cost savings so the buyer doesn't have to keep doing bake-offs and bake-offs and bake-offs, as they go along, or just crossing their fingers.
Yeah, just to add to that, when we launched the certification program, we're hoping to be able to do a couple beta tests and, from that learn kind of like, where we need to make some tweaks, what needs to happen, and how we can make it better if we need to make it better. So that's kind of like a goal with, looking to, launch towards the end of the year that we'll have a couple betas. Yeah.
Great. We have time for one more quick question.
Quick question about how do you guard against deepfake and having that put on a printed, like say you print out use a deepfake algorithm and then you print out a document that looks similar and you have OCR. How do you prevent those types of attacks?
You're right. You get that one.
I'll take it. I've been thinking a lot about this, so thank you for the question. No, so, essentially what we're asking vendors to do is they are capturing, this document as well as capturing the selfie, right? So the protection mechanisms are in there, whether it be a deepfake or a spoof, right? And some of those protected, depends on where you're putting in the deepfake. So from a biometric point of view, if you're using the deepfake as potentially a way of bypassing the liveness, right? Then those liveness solutions won't be as effective as others. So we can put that in the attack types of that we're testing as part of the lab. Now that might be a more sophisticated attack type, might not go in the first version of the standard, but then we can start incorporating those types of attacks into the testing as we go along. The other thing that people are worried about on the biometric side using deepfakes is the bypassing the sensor itself. And so we really, and I don't know how it's exactly going to land in the requirements, but essentially, I think it would be almost impossible to be certified if all your solution does is said, click here and upload your photo that you've taken, from wherever, right? Those solutions, won't be able to pass because they're not doing a live capture of the individual. And so we're calling that injection attacks. Really, what we're trying to avoid is people bypassing the sensor itself, so that way the liveness can do its job to help us with deepfakes.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Yep. Oh yeah, I was supposed to be short.
More.
We'll talk.
Come up and talk to her afterwards. Thank you very much. And I want to thank our panelists again, Ray, Stephanie, and Jeremy. Appreciate your all your comments. Thanks.